The city was quiet that night, or as quiet as a city ever gets. For one police officer, the end of his shift didn't bring peace. It brought a restlessness that settled deep in his bones. The day had been a long string of frustrations. Angry people, pointless arguments, and the feeling that he was just a tiny cog in a giant broken machine. He felt unseen and unappreciated, so instead of heading home to his empty apartment, he drove to a dimly lit bar on the other side of town, a place where he hoped nobody would recognize the uniform he had just taken off. He sat alone on a worn-out stool, the glow of the television reflecting in his glass. With each drink, the sharp edges of his bad day began to blur. The noise of the bar faded into a dull hum in the back of his mind. The weight of his job, his personal problems, all of it started to feel lighter, drowned out by the alcohol coursing through him. He wasn't thinking about procedure or duty anymore. He was just a man trying to forget. Hours slipped by unnoticed. When he finally stood up to leave, the room tilted slightly. He fumbled for his keys, a voice in the back of his head, a tiny, sober voice telling him this was a bad idea. But he ignored it. He was trained to handle situations, to be in control. He convinced himself he was fine. Meanwhile, in a small, well-kept apartment a few blocks away, a woman was enjoying the simple peace of her own company. She had worked hard all day at her computer, and now her home was her sanctuary. The soft light from a lamp filled the living room, and the faint smell of the dinner she had cooked still hung in the air. She loved this little space. It was more than just an apartment. It was her own piece of the world, a place where she felt completely safe. She had watered her collection of houseplants, her fingers brushing the leaves with a gentle care. Now she was curled up on her sofa with a book, a soft blanket over her legs. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional turning of a page. For her, this was a perfect, quiet night. Back in his car, the officer started the engine. His mind, foggy with drink, was stuck on the last difficult call of his shift. A report of a man with a weapon that had turned out to be nothing. But in his intoxicated state, the memory twisted and mutated. The details got mixed up. The address, which he had only glanced at, became confused with another building in his mind. A dangerous suspect was out there, he told himself. He felt a surge of purpose. He was the only one who could handle it. He bypassed calling it in. He didn't wait for backup. This was his chance to do something important to prove his worth. His training had flown out the window, replaced by alcohol-fueled bravado. His car weaved slightly as he drove, finally pulling up to an apartment building. It was the wrong one, but in his mind it was the right place. This was where the danger was. He marched through the parking lot, his footsteps heavy and unsteady. The world seemed to pulse around him. He climbed the stairs, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. He reached a door, her door. He didn't see the welcome mat or the little potted plant sitting beside it. He didn't see a home. He saw a target. Inside, the woman heard a heavy thud against her door. She looked up from her book, her heart giving a sudden, hard leap. Was that someone outside? Maybe a neighbor stumbling home, she thought, trying to calm herself. But then it came again. Louder this time. A bang that made her front door shake in its frame. This was no accident. This was a force meant to break. Her blood ran cold. She dropped her book and stood up, her body tense with fear. Standing outside, the officer took a stumbling step back. He yelled something, his words slurred and angry, a command to open up. But he didn't give her a chance. He didn't identify himself. Rage and alcohol had taken over completely. He threw his weight against the door, once, twice. With a sickening crack of splintering wood, the lock gave way. The door flew open, crashing against the wall inside. The woman stood frozen in her living room, her hand flying to her mouth. A large man was standing in her broken doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. He was breathing heavily. For a terrifying second, her mind couldn't make sense of it. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw the glimpse of a uniform. It was a police officer. But nothing about this felt like the police. This felt like a nightmare. He stepped into her home, his eyes wild and unfocused, scanning the room but not really seeing it. He was mumbling, talking about a suspect, about a weapon. His words were a jumbled mess. The smell of alcohol hit her from several feet away. This man wasn't just aggressive. He was drunk, and he was standing in the middle of her living room, having shattered her front door and with it her sense of safety. In that moment, her fear was so thick she could taste it. But beneath the fear, something else sparked, a fierce protective instinct. This was her home. and she was not going to be a victim in her own home. The world stopped. For a single, heart-stopping second, the woman in the apartment and the officer in the doorway were frozen in a terrible picture. The only sound was the ragged, heavy breathing of the man who had just broken in. The peaceful smell of her home was now mixed with the cold night air and the faint, sharp smell of alcohol. Her mind screamed, a silent internal siren of pure panic. Every instinct told her to run, to hide, to scream. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her eyes darted from his face, red and twisted with anger, down to the weapon on his hip. The reality of the situation was a physical blow. This was not a dream. This was really happening. But then, cutting through the terror, a different thought fought its way to the surface. It was a clear, sharp voice in her head. Evidence, you need proof. If she didn't record this, who would believe her? His word against hers. A police officer against a single woman in her own home. The thought filled her with a new kind of dread. One that was colder and more calculating than the initial shock. Her phone was on the coffee table, right next to the sofa where she had been peacefully reading just moments before. It felt a million miles away. She forced her body to move, her muscles tight with fear. She took one slow, careful step backward, then another, her eyes never leaving the officer. He was still mumbling, his gaze sweeping across her living room as if he expected a criminal to jump out from behind her sofa. "Where is he?" he slurred, taking a lurching step further inside. "I know he's in here." Her fingers brushed against the cool, hard surface of her phone. She snatched it up, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped it. With a frantic swipe of her thumb, she unlocked it and opened the camera app. The screen lit up, a small rectangle of light in the dark, tense room. She pointed it at him, her arm shaking. She had to make her voice work. She had to speak. "You are in my home," she said. The words came out quieter than she wanted, trembling with the fear she felt. She took a sharp breath, forcing strength into her voice. "You are in my home. Identify yourself." The officer seemed to notice her for the first time, really notice her. The light from the phone screen illuminated his face, and for a flicker of a second, his expression changed. The aggressive confidence wavered. He looked confused, as if he was just waking up from a dream. He squinted at the bright light. "Put that down," he growled, waving a hand dismissively. "I'm conducting an investigation. This is my home," she repeated, her voice growing steadier, fueled by a rising anger that was starting to burn away the fear. "You broke my door. You have no right to be here. What is your name? What is your badge number?" She kept the camera trained on him, a silent witness. The video was capturing everything. The splintered doorframe, his unsteady posture, the empty, peaceful apartment that clearly held no one else. It captured the sheer normality of her life. The book on the sofa, the plants on the windowsill, the soft blanket crumpled on the floor where she had dropped it. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he took another clumsy step, peering down her hallway. "I need to clear the premises," he muttered, but his voice had lost its force. He was starting to look less like a hunter and more like a lost, drunk man who had stumbled into the wrong place. The woman held her ground. She didn't back down. She continued to speak, her words clear and direct, a stark contrast to his slurred speech. "There is no one else here. You are trespassing. You need to leave now." He stopped and turned to look at her again. The phone's camera was like a spotlight, and he seemed to shrink under its gaze. The reality of what he had done was beginning to pierce the alcoholic fog in his brain. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the defiant strength. He saw the recording phone, a tool that could destroy him. He looked at the broken door, a crime scene that he had created. His bravado crumbled. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. He had made a catastrophic mistake. He took a step back toward the shattered doorway. Then another. He raised a hand not in a threat, but almost as if to shield himself from the truth. "Ma'am, he stammered, but no other words came out. What could he say? He turned and stumbled out through the broken door, his footsteps echoing heavily down the hallway outside. Just like that, he was gone. The woman stood perfectly still for a long time, the phone still held out in front of her, still recording. She was listening, her whole body tense, waiting for him to come back. The only sound was the frantic, loud beating of her own heart in her ears. Slowly, carefully, she walked to the doorway and looked out. The hallway was empty. She looked down at the screen of her phone and finally stopped the recording. In the sudden silence, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. Her legs felt weak and she leaned against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. A violent shudder ran through her body. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she couldn't stop shaking. Her eyes fell on the wreckage of her front door. It was hanging open, broken, useless. The cold night air poured in. Her safe place, her sanctuary, had been violently ripped open. Anyone could just walk in. She felt exposed and terrifyingly vulnerable. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she angrily wiped them away. This was not the time to cry. This was the time to act. She still had the phone clutched in her hand. The video was there. The proof was there. She knew this wasn't over. A man, a police officer, had broken into her home while drunk. He had terrified her and destroyed her property. He had violated her rights in the worst way possible. He had walked away, but she knew he would try to cover his tracks. He would probably lie, but he had made one big mistake. He hadn't counted on her. He hadn't counted on her keeping her head in a moment of pure terror. He hadn't counted on the phone and the clear, steady voice that demanded answers. She looked at the broken door again. It was a symbol of what he had done. But the phone in her hand, that was a symbol of something else. It was her power. It was the truth. Sitting there on the floor in the cold draft from the hallway, she made a decision. She would not be silent. She would not let this be swept under the rug. That video was not just a record of a crime. It was a weapon, and she was going to use it. The officer stumbled down the hallway, the world tilting and swimming around him. The woman's voice, so clear and sharp, seemed to echo in his ears, chasing him. "You are in my home!" The words were like slaps cutting through the thick fog in his brain. He fumbled for the stairwell, almost falling down the first flight of steps. The cold night air hit him like a physical blow as he burst out of the building, but it did nothing to clear his head. It just made him feel more exposed. He slumped into the driver's seat of his car, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. For a few long minutes, he just sat there, his head resting against the steering wheel. The full, horrifying weight of what he had done was beginning to press down on him. He had broken into a home. A citizen's home. He had terrified a woman who was just sitting in her own living room. And she had recorded all of it. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. He had to fix this. He had to create a story, a reason for what he had done. He couldn't lose his job. He couldn't go to jail. His mind, still muddled, scrambled for an excuse. A call. There had to have been a call. A report of a disturbance. That was it. He would say he was responding to a call about a domestic dispute, heard yelling, and found the door open. He was just doing his job. He was protecting the public. It was a weak story, full of holes, but it was all he had. He started the car and drove away from the apartment building, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He drove straight to the police station, the lies already forming and reforming in his mind, trying to harden into something believable. Back in the apartment, the woman was still sitting on the floor, her back against the wall. The initial shock was wearing off, leaving behind a raw, trembling fear. The broken door was a constant, terrifying reminder that she was not safe. She needed to secure her home. With a great effort, she pushed herself up. Her legs felt like jelly. She went to the kitchen and pulled out a heavy chair. She dragged it to the doorway and wedged it under the doorknob. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it made her feel a little bit better. A small physical barrier between her and the world. Then she picked up her phone again. Her first call was to her brother. Her voice was a shaky whisper as she told him what happened. He just broke the door down, she stammered, tears finally starting to fall. He was a police officer, and he was drunk. Her brother, his own voice tight with anger and concern, told her he was on his way. He also told her the two most important things she needed to do right away: call a lawyer and call the local news. The thought of calling the news was terrifying. It meant going public. It meant putting her face and her story out there for everyone to see. But she also knew her brother was right. If she only reported it to the police, it could be buried. The officer's word against hers. The video was her only real power. Her hands were still trembling as she looked up the number for a well-known civil rights lawyer in the city. When she got through to the emergency line, the voice on the other end was calm and professional. She told her story again, her voice growing a little stronger each time. The lawyer listened intently. "Do you have any evidence?" he asked. "I have a video," she said. "I recorded the whole thing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. That changes everything, the lawyer said, his voice now filled with a new intensity. Do not speak to the police without me present. Email me the video immediately. We need to move quickly. Next, she called the tip line for the biggest local news station. She gave them the basic facts. An off-duty intoxicated police officer had forcibly entered her home. She mentioned she had video evidence. The person on the phone became very interested very fast. They took down her information and said a reporter would call her back shortly. Within the hour, her brother was there, his presence a solid comfort. He helped her board up the broken door with a piece of plywood he had brought. It was a temporary fix, but it blocked out the cold air and the feeling of being exposed. As they worked, her phone rang. It was the reporter. She spoke to the reporter, with her lawyer now on the line as well. They asked her questions, and she answered, her voice steadier now. Then, as her lawyer had instructed, she sent the video file. At the news station, the reporter and her editor watched the video on a computer screen. The footage was shaky, but it was devastatingly clear. They saw the broken door, the officer's unsteady posture, his slurred speech. They heard the woman's brave, trembling voice demanding he identify himself. They saw the moment his aggression turned to confusion and then to retreat. It was all there. It was undeniable. This is huge, the editor whispered. They prepared a short, powerful news segment for their website and social media. They did not sensationalize it. They simply presented the facts and showed key blurred parts of the video. They protected the woman's identity for the moment, using only her first initial. The story went live at 10 p.m. It started slowly. A few shares, then a few dozen, then hundreds. People were horrified. The video was so raw, so personal. It showed the terrifying reality of a person's safe space being destroyed by the very person who was supposed to protect it. Comments flooded in. People were angry. They demanded answers. They demanded justice. By midnight, the story was trending locally. By the next morning, it was being picked up by national news outlets. The public outcry was like a wave, growing bigger and louder with every passing hour. The police department was caught completely off guard. The chief of police saw the news on his television while drinking his morning coffee. His blood ran cold. He immediately called his deputy. What in God's name is this? He demanded. Did we have a report of this? They checked the logs. The only report they had was from the officer himself, filed late last night about a domestic disturbance call at that address. It suddenly looked very flimsy, very convenient, and it was completely contradicted by the video evidence now being seen by millions. The chief knew immediately that they had a massive crisis on their hands. The trust between the community and his department, something that was already fragile, was about to shatter completely. He had to act and act fast. He ordered an immediate internal investigation. Then he picked up the phone and called the officer at home. The officer had seen the news. He had spent a sleepless night, his stomach churning with dread. When the phone rang and he saw the chief's number, he felt a surge of nausea. He knew his life as he knew it was over. Don't you come into this building, the chief's voice was cold, sharp with fury. You are suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your gun to the desk sergeant now, and you better get yourself a lawyer. The phone went dead. The officer sat in the silence of his own home, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. He had thought he could lie his way out of it. He had thought his badge would protect him, but he had never counted on the quiet, fierce courage of a woman in her own home, or the power of the truth she held in her hand. His story was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The days that followed were a whirlwind, a strange mix of quiet fear and loud public chaos. For the woman, the world had become a different place. She stayed with her brother, too afraid to return to her own apartment even with the new door that had been installed. The memory of the crashing sound and the man standing in her doorway played over and over in her mind, a terrible loop she couldn't stop. She jumped at sudden noises. She found it hard to sleep, but she was not alone. Her lawyer was a steady, calm presence handling the flood of calls and messages. Her family surrounded her, a protective wall of love and support. And then there was the public. Strangers from all over the city and then the country sent her messages of support. They shared their own stories of feeling powerless. They told her she was brave. For the first time since that night, she didn't feel like just a victim. She felt like she was part of something bigger. She had a voice and people were listening. Meanwhile, inside the police department, the internal affairs investigation was moving like a slow, precise machine. The investigators were seasoned professionals, and they knew a cover-up when they saw one. They started by pulling the officer's records. They saw the report he had filed after the incident, a flimsy story about a domestic disturbance. It fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. Their first stop was the bar the officer had visited. The bartender remembered him clearly. "He was here for hours," the bartender said, shaking his head. "Drank a lot. I was a little worried when he left, to be honest." The bar's security cameras confirmed it, showing the officer drinking steadily alone for a long time. Next, they checked the GPS data from his personal car. The digital breadcrumbs told a clear story. It showed his car leaving the bar, driving around aimlessly for a while, and then heading directly to the woman's apartment building. He had never been dispatched there. There was no record of any emergency call from that address or anything nearby. His claim that he was responding to a call was a complete lie. The final undeniable piece was the woman's video. The internal affairs team watched it in a silent room. They saw the splintered doorframe. They saw their colleague's unsteady, aggressive posture. They heard his slurred speech and her clear, brave questions. There was no arguing with it. The evidence was a mountain, and it was all piled against one man. The district attorney's office, watching the public anger grow, knew they had to act. This was more than just an internal police matter. It was a criminal act. They charged the former officer with multiple crimes. The list was long and serious. Burglary for illegally entering a home with the intent to commit a crime. Official misconduct for abusing his power. Criminal trespass, and destruction of property. When the news of the criminal charges was announced, it felt like a victory to the public. But for the woman, it was just one step. A criminal case would punish the officer, but it wouldn't fix what was broken. It wouldn't give her back her sense of safety or repair the trauma. It wouldn't change the system that had allowed a man like that to wear a badge. So with her lawyer by her side, she took another huge step. She filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the former officer and the police department itself. The lawsuit was not just about money. It was about accountability. It claimed the department had failed to properly train and supervise its officers. It claimed they had a culture that allowed this kind of behavior to fester. She was suing for the profound emotional distress she had suffered, but she was also demanding change, better training, new policies, and a real independent system to hold police accountable. The lawsuit sent another shockwave through the city. The police department was now facing immense pressure from all sides, from the public, from the media, and now from the courts. The chief, who had been so furious, now looked tired and defeated. He had to answer difficult questions at a press conference, his face grim under the bright lights. He promised reform, he promised transparency, but for many the promises felt hollow. They had heard them before. For the former officer, his life had shrunk to the size of a small dark room. He was fired. His friends, most of whom were on the force, stopped calling. He was a pariah, a living symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. The criminal charges hung over his head, threatening to send him to prison. The lawsuit threatened to take everything he had left. He spent his days staring at the walls, the weight of his regret so heavy it was a physical pain. He had lost his career, his reputation, and his self-respect. He had thought he was invincible, but he was just a man who had made a terrible, terrible mistake. And now he was drowning in the consequences. The woman, reading the news about the lawsuit from her brother's house, felt a small sense of closure. The wheels of justice, though slow, were turning. But she knew the fight was far from over. The legal battles would take years. The fear was still there, a shadow in the back of her mind. But she also felt a new strength. She had been pushed to the edge, but she had not fallen. She had fought back. And she was only just beginning. Emma, Jamal, etc. The story did not have a quick, clean ending. There was no single moment where everything was fixed. Instead, the months and years that followed were a long, slow journey of healing and consequence. For the woman, the first and most difficult step was learning to feel safe again. The sound of a door slamming downstairs would make her heart jump into her throat. A sudden knock at the door would send a jolt of fear through her entire body. She decided she could never go back to that apartment. The memories in those walls were too dark, too heavy. With part of the financial settlement from her lawsuit, she bought a small house in a different neighborhood. It had a garden where she could plant flowers and a strong, solid front door with a good lock. It took a long time, but slowly this new place began to feel like a real home. The shadows of that night began to slowly fade, replaced by new, peaceful memories. But she didn't just want to hide away in her new home. The experience had changed her in a fundamental way. She had seen how the system could fail, and she had also seen the power of one person to stand up and demand change. She started working quietly with community groups that focused on police accountability. She didn't often tell her own story publicly, but she used her experience to guide her. She met with city council members, advocating for better de-escalation training for officers and for a stronger, independent civilian review board to look into complaints. She wasn't shouting. She was persuading. She was a quiet, steady voice reminding everyone that behind every policy, there is a human being who deserves to feel safe in their own home. Her legacy wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a push for a more just and compassionate system. For the former police officer, the consequences were his constant companions. The criminal case finally came to an end. Faced with the mountain of evidence, he accepted a plea deal. He stood in a courtroom, a place where he had once testified as an officer of the law, and now stood as a convicted felon. He was sentenced to prison. The sound of the cell door closing behind him was a sound he would never forget. It was the final echoing crash of the door he had broken down. Prison was a harsh, lonely existence. He was isolated, viewed with contempt by both other inmates and the guards. The uniform he wore now was a constant reminder of everything he had lost. The forever regret was his life sentence. He had endless hours to think, to replay that night over and over in his head. He thought about the woman, about the terror he must have caused her. He thought about his own arrogance, his belief that the badge made him untouchable. The alcohol had been a trigger, but the sense of entitlement, he realized, had been there all along. He was not a victim. He was the cause. That was the heaviest truth to bear. After serving his time, he was released, but his punishment was far from over. He was a felon. He would never be able to work in law enforcement again. He would never be able to own a firearm. Finding any kind of stable job was incredibly difficult. The lawsuit from the woman had taken most of his savings and his pension. He lived a small, quiet, and isolated life, moving from one low-paying job to another. He was a ghost of his former self, haunted by a mistake that had defined and destroyed his life. The forever regret was not just a feeling, it was his reality. The city itself was changed by the event. The public outrage had been too loud to ignore. The police department, under new leadership, was forced to implement real reforms. They instituted mandatory ongoing training on de-escalation, implicit bias, and the dangers of alcohol abuse. The Independent Civilian Review Board was created, giving the community a real voice in overseeing police conduct. It wasn't a perfect solution, and trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but it was a start. The woman's courage had created a ripple effect that made the city a little fairer, a little safer for everyone. Years later, on a quiet afternoon, the woman was working in her garden. The sun was warm on her back, and her hands were dirty from the soil. She felt a sense of peace that she had once thought was lost forever. Her life was not defined by that one terrible night. It was shaped by her resilience, her strength, and her choice to build something good from something so bad. She sometimes thought about the officer. There was no forgiveness in her heart, not in a simple way, but there was the understanding that his life had become a prison of his own making, while she had worked to free herself from the one he had tried to put her in. He was trapped by his past while she had built a future. The broken door of her old apartment was now just a memory. But the new door on her house was a symbol of something else. It was a door she had chosen. It was a door she controlled. It was a door that led to a life she had reclaimed with immense courage. Her story was ultimately one of triumph, not because the bad man was punished, but because the good woman had found a way to heal, to grow, and to make a difference. And that was a regret he would have to live with forever.